Hi there, I'm Larisa Miller. I am CEO of Phoenix Global, which is a Miami-based investment and consulting firm, and I'm also president of the newly formed BPW Miami. I'd like to invite all of you who will be coming to Florida in August for the BPW Congress to visit us in Miami and allow the BPW Florida Club to show our sisters some lovely Florida hospitality. Today, I'm going to speak with you about the women and the global refugee crisis, turning tragedy into triumph. Ways that we can look to empower refugee women and displaced women so that we can generate opportunity for them and thus generate hope. I have spent several years visiting refugee camps. Prior to joining Phoenix Global, I did the business development for the royal family in Abu Dhabi and was also the head of their large nonprofit foundation. That took me to refugee camps in Iraq and Jordan and Yemen and in the rural areas of Africa. I have quite a unique perspective on the refugee crisis, having been to so many different types of camps and so many different geographic locales. And each of the refugees was displaced for different reasons, which also helps to enhance the perspective, because there are so many reasons that people find themselves as refugees, not just for global crisis and war, but due to climate change, due to the extreme weather shifts we have, due to economic downturn. At COP15 in Paris in 2015, it was revealed that the GCC, the region of the UAE and Bahrain and Oman, that would be uninhabitable this generation due to excessive heat. So there you have an educated, very complex, developed society where the people will be forced to become refugees unless we do something to mitigate the climate change crisis. But today I'd like to talk to you about women in the refugee camps and share some of my memories and some of my photos and some of my perspectives with you. This photo on the very first slide was taken in the Marajib Al Food Camp in outside of Amman in Jordan. So there are currently 70.8 million refugees worldwide. And of those, 25.9 million are true refugees by definition. 41.3 million are internally displaced people, which means they're displaced, but they remain in their own countries. And 3.5 million are asylum seekers, meaning that they want to find a new homeland and have no intentions of returning back to their original homeland. Of these 70.8 million, the majority of the global refugees are Afghani, Syrian, or South Sudanese. This slide comes from, again, my visit to Iraq, outside of Mosul in northern Iraq. And it's a collection of photos of the children that I encounter, because that's really what touches my heart, but also the women. I love to photograph the women and spend time with the women, because you truly see just how strong women are, and that women are the backbone of families all around the world, regardless of your socioeconomics, your geographics, regardless of whether you are in an educated white collar household in Connecticut, or if you are a refugee displaced from your homeland in a foreign country. Women truly are the backbone and many times the breadwinners in families in refugee camps. So 35 million refugees are women. 30 million refugees are under 18, both male and female. 11.9% are between the ages of 14 and 20, and 43.4 are under the age of 14. And of those 43.4, almost 100% of them have been born inside the refugee camps or displaced away from their homeland. And most have little hope of ever returning to their original homelands. So I'd like to share with you as I go through my slide presentation today a little bit about the actual photos that you will see. And these were two different families, both in a refugee camp outside of Mosul. The picture on the right was a young little girl in a family that welcomed me into their tent. The mother had offered me the only food that she had to serve for her family. She was going to make that available to me. And to me, that was such a heartfelt and beautiful moment, although I didn't want to take their food because that food that she was offering me was the only food that she had to feed her family of 10. And it struck me at that moment that how many of us would with plentiful food would have someone that we would walk in, welcome into our homes and then offer them our food. Or if it was the only food we had, would we be willing to offer it to a visitor rather than saving it for our families? And yet so readily, knowing that was the only food they had for the day, they were absolutely offering it to me with the warmest hospitality. And you can see in that picture just how the years of displacement and the years of worry and struggle take a toll, because that mother was 41 years old. And this was the youngest of her children, but at only 41 years old, you can really see the hardship on her face. So this was also taken in Iraq. And as I look at this, it reminds me that regardless of who we are, our races, our cultures, our religions, even our genders, we are all one. We are all the same. And a mother is a mother and cares for her children regardless of where she lives in the world. And when you consider that 1 in every 113 people around the world is either an asylum seeker or an internally displaced refugee, that's a very staggering number. And to put that further into context for you, one person becomes displaced every 3 seconds, which is 20 people forced from their homes every minute, or 28,300 every single day. And that could very easily be any one of us, as we face such extreme shifts in weather patterns in the world, where we're having now superstorms here in the United States. The hurricanes are so much worse than they ever were in the past. And conversely, in areas of the world, you have such extreme heat that people are being forced to migrate. It also causes extremes in the weather patterns, from drought to very serious rains that ruin crops and force migration. We will have political strife, we have wars, and all of this could happen to any one of us in any country, regardless of how developed it is. So we owe it to our sisters, regardless of where they live in the world, regardless of what our circumstances are or theirs, to come together to find ways to empower all women so that we can make a difference in this UN declared century of women. This is our century to make a difference. The reality is, with all of the wonderful work that humanitarian organizations are doing around the world in refugee camps and for urban refugees, and for the refugees that are migratory or those displaced in Africa, only 4% of the projects in the UN's interagency appeals are targeting women and girls. This was a statistic in 2014, and not much has changed. And just 0.4% of all funding went to fragile states, to women's groups or to women's ministries from 2012 to 2013. We can do better. We owe it to women to do better. We owe it to refugees to do better, because when you have an empowered woman in a household, in a refugee community, that refugee family has a much higher percentage of finding their way outside of the refugee camp back into a stable living environment, either there in the area where they have been forced to migrate, or it allows them to be able to return home. So in the world's conflict zones, 10 million girls are not in school, and girls account for only 30% of the refugees who are enrolled in secondary school. And we must remember that education reduces the likelihood of early pregnancy, because the more years you have in education, the fewer pregnancies you have. And education is critical for girls to be able to develop the skills that will get them work and that will allow them to be able to support themselves. And it also gives them a certain degree of confidence that allows them to stand up for themselves, and reduces the probability that they will be victims of gender-based violence. This was the same family that you saw in the previous slide. This is them. We were sitting in their tent. The tent is one big room in a PVC hut, which gets very, very hot in an Iraqi summer. But they pull the blankets out at night, and 10 of them sleep in very crafty positions so that there's room for all of them. And during the day, the blankets are put away and it becomes their living environment. And it really is a very rudimentary life. But when you see that even refugees in a refugee camp can find a reason to smile. In one of my other presentations that I did, I said, when people that live in circumstances beyond our imagining can find a reason to smile, there isn't a reason for any of us to not find a reason to be able to smile each and every day. Refugee women are extremely vulnerable to sexual assault, exploitation, and rape. In gender-based violence, 50% of the victims are 15 years of age. So when you combine education with an awareness of gender-based violence and the measures that we can do to prevent gender-based violence, and the fact that educated women and women who have an opportunity for employment, women who have an opportunity to turn themselves into entrepreneurs, women who aren't dependent necessarily on humanitarian aid or a male figure, male head of household to provide for the family, are much more likely to not fall into the statistics of the gender-based violence. And when you have an educated child, you have a higher probability that these children will grow up to be able to seek employment and make a choice and have a say in their future, and not become child brides at 15 years old, say. Which is something that occurs all around the world, sadly, in many cultures. But in refugee camps, it's very prevalent. And largely young ladies are married at 13 or 14 years old, so that their family can ensure that their virginity is intact and that it doesn't become an embarrassment for the family. So they marry them off at very young ages. And I can tell you that these are young ladies just like we have, our daughters, who want to go to school, who have hopes and dreams and visions, who smile and play. And when you see a 13-year-old girl, she has every right to still have a doll in her hands. She should not be forced to be a child bride. The women in the refugee camps are definitely, without a doubt, and I say this from my perspective, I don't say this based on any data or anything quantifiable, but I've been in enough refugee camps to tell you that it is women who are the caretakers of the entire family. When you pull into a refugee camp, and I can say this because in refugee camps in Jordan, in Yemen, in Iraq, it was all the same. The men are always congregated together, like no care in the world. And the women are the ones that are fighting for every bit of food that they can get, for every opportunity that they have, for every humanitarian delivery that is coming their way. They're taking care of the children. They're cooking the food. They're finding the fuel to fuel the fires, the cooking fires. And they are really the ones that are the backbone of the refugee family. And they really need the support to be able to turn their skills into enterprises where they can be earning some money. And they need to have the opportunity to learn new skills so that they can be breadwinners and potentially get their families out of the circumstances for which they themselves did nothing to create. More than 60 million girls and young women, some as young as 10 years old in developing countries, are married before the age of 18. And young brides are most likely to experience gender-based violence. They drop out of school, they have sexually transmitted diseases, and in Africa especially, very, very high rates of HIV. 41% of young Syrian women in refugee camps are married under the age of 18. And in fact, in almost all of the refugee camps that I've visited, most all of the young women who are 18 years old already have children. In many communities, as I mentioned in the previous slide, marriage is seen as a way to protect a girl's virginity and the family honor by extension, and by extension, a family's reputation. So the younger they marry the girl, the less likely they are to face some sort of gender-based violence or sex crime that will essentially make their daughter untouchable. In refugee camps, one of the most serious problems is the high prevalence for serious burns. Fires and serious burns occur in refugee camps daily. Almost every single family has a member that has at least third-degree burns somewhere on their body. The cooking stoves, as you can see in this picture, it's just a very small rudimentary hob with just enough room for a dinner plate on top. But they're largely kerosene fired stoves. So you have women in refugee camps who are so prone to respiratory disease and distress and death due to the toxins that come from their cooking implements. So they face a myriad of challenges that we can't even fathom on a daily basis, from just their domestic chores, let alone the fact that without electricity at night, they are victims. More than 55% of women in refugee camps have been victimized at night somewhere in the refugee camp because it's dark. This little girl was in a refugee camp in Jordan, and you can see on her foot the third-degree burns because the kerosene heater in our kerosene stove fell over in her tent, and she was burned on the ankle. In refugee camps, food items like the rice and the dried beans and grains are distributed, but they all need to be cooked before they're eaten. Generally, cooking fuel isn't provided, so that is something that a family has to earn enough money, peddling oranges or their garments that they make, or handicrafts, to be able to buy the cooking fuel, or the women have to go out and forage for wood or other means of starting a fire. All things having to do with meals and cooking and cleaning and children and clothing are all seen as women's work, especially in the Middle Eastern refugee camps. And when you consider that a day in the refugee camp, that is the entire day. There isn't anything else. Like I mentioned earlier, the women are the true backbone. The men have their breakfast and they go off for the day, and that's it. And the women are the ones that are really finding the way to ensure that their families survive. But when women go out to look for the resources to be able to start their cooking fire, if they don't have enough money to be able to buy the fuel, many times they are victimized while they are out looking for the fuel. And authorities do nothing to the perpetrators. So therefore, is it really considered a crime? Nearly half the deaths among children under 5 are from acute lower respiratory infections due to inhaled matters in the very poorly ventilated tents that they live in. Women are often and this goes for our societies as well, women are often the first responders in a crisis, whether in a camp or whether in a city. They play a very crucial role in caring for and sustaining and rebuilding their communities and families. With the prevalence for fires in these refugee camps due to the kerosene, this particular slide was when I was in Iraq with the Emirates Red Crescent, and you can see the Secretary General of the Red Crescent here in the forefront. And this woman was in a tent in a different refugee camp with her family, and the kerosene stove she was cooking on fell over, and the tent was engulfed in flames. And she threw herself on the flames to prevent her children from being burned. And she wound up with very serious third-degree burns all over her entire body. They took her children to a series of different camps, and they brought her to this camp where they had the most sophisticated medical treatment to handle her burns. And when we got there, her burns were very fresh on this day. It had just happened, but when we got there, she immediately sought us out and made a plea to the Secretary General. And it wasn't a plea for her own well-being or for her own care or any sort of help to heal her. It was simply because her children were all separated from one another and from her, and she made an appeal to him to please bring her children all back together with her. And by that evening, all the children had been collected and returned and reunited with their mother there in this camp outside of Mosul. So refugee women could contribute up to 1.4 trillion to the global GDP if they had equal access to jobs. That's a very significant number, 1.4 trillion to the global GDP. And it's all about giving them skills and giving them opportunity. And here in this refugee camp, the women had been provided with sewing machines, and they had been provided with fabrics to be able to make garments that they could turn into an enterprise for themselves to sell, to be able to earn money for their families. And yet the women sat behind the sewing machines, and the sewing machines were quiet because so many humanitarian organizations collect used clothes from around the world, or have new clothes drives around the world, and they send the clothes to the refugee camps, and the clothes are given away for free. And so as you can see in the bags in the background, you know, all of those clothes that had been made by the refugee women sit there without a market because of the sheer number of clothing coming in through humanitarian organizations. And as I rethink the strategy for empowering refugees, it should be that we provide them the knowledge, and we provide them the tools, and we provide them the access to markets, but not necessarily providing them with the end use product, because we limit the ability for them to be able to help themselves and turn themselves into entrepreneurs when we give them the finished product. Providing them with fabric, providing them with thread, humanitarian organizations that donate sewing machines. It's phenomenal. And these women are so proud to be able to contribute and so proud to be able to do something for themselves that other people are willing to buy and that essentially helps their families. But if everything is given to them, the sewing machines are quiet. This is the century of women, and we are all people, we are all global citizens, and we are all sisters, which we, BPW sisters, we know that better than anyone, the power of sisterhood. And we are all one. And together we are unstoppable. Together we have the power to change the world. And the UN, in their infinite wisdom, declared this the century of women. And, you know, I like to say that they gave us the most tumultuous century in the history of mankind, because men have made a mess through the last many centuries, and they know that women have the power to fix it. But we can only fix it if we come together and we join one another, because as I said, together we are unstoppable. Thank you.